Okay, let's welcome our final speaker, Nabeel Gillani, who will talk about redrawing attendance boundaries.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. I'm Nabeel. I'm an assistant professor at Northeastern, and I'm here to talk on behalf of my colleagues across the MIT Center for Constructive Communication and Georgia Tech about our project, which is titled Redrawing Attendance Boundaries to Increase Racial and Ethnic Diversity in Elementary Schools. So I just want to start, I think we heard a little bit yesterday about sort of why this issue of diversity and segregation in schools is important, and just sort of how it's exacerbating over time despite efforts over the past several decades, especially 70 years ago with Brown v. Board. There's a lot of reasons why segregation is concerning. One is because segregation of race and class in schools often also segregates resources, quality teaching, et cetera. And of course, that kind of exacerbates educational disparities and achievement gaps. It also can segregate networks, so it can prevent the sharing of social capital between families and sort of families coming together to really sort of help lift one another to have a higher quality of life, and of course the impact on children. And there's been recent work kind of talking about the importance of that social capital. And then I think finally, as we kind of just think about, I think a lot of us hear about, fragmenting democracy and just our inability to really connect with each other. If from the earliest ages, our kids are going to the schools where they're not really connecting with people from different backgrounds, they're not really seeing those worldviews, that doesn't bode well, I think, for the future of a country and the kind of country that we want to build. So just want to motivate it. I think there's a lot of different kind of layers that sort of make this problem a problem, and something that we're interested in. Now, there's a lot of reasons why segregation persists. That we heard a little bit about school choice and sort of how that can lead to worse segregation. A common kind of policy across most schools, or rather most districts, for assigning students to schools is what's called attendance boundaries. And so basically, districts will kind of look at their map and they'll draw circles or boundaries around certain neighborhoods and say these neighborhoods should go to these schools, these neighborhoods should go to these schools. And this is an example of attendance boundaries in the city of Atlanta. Particularly for elementary schools. Now, this seems fine, except when you start to factor in patterns of residential segregation. So again, I think we've seen a version of this actually for Atlanta recently, but this is sort of the white, non-white population in Atlanta. The white population is predominantly concentrated in the north and northeast parts of the city, the non-white population, the south and southwest. And you can imagine sort of what this means when you're using attendance boundaries to assign children to schools, sort of what the racial and ethnic composition of those schools is going to look like. And so in theory, we could draw boundaries however we want, right? We could redraw boundaries in ways that would actually promote integration, but redrawing boundaries is extremely contentious and time consuming. Parents get really upset when you talk about changing boundaries. They often buy homes kind of in neighborhoods because they're zoned for particular schools. And so we asked this question of, can we use machines basically to factor in parents' preferences to algorithmically redraw boundaries in ways that would start to promote integration? And so the way we kind of approach this problem, I know you probably can't read all of this, but we started with a bunch of different data sets. So we kind of took a top-down approach to start with. We captured data from the Department of Education on student enrollment in schools by racial and ethnic backgrounds. We used census data. We purchased kind of attendance boundary data for districts across the US. And then we actually used what's called the Open Route Service API, which actually can estimate travel times between kind of two pairs of lat longs, which I wasn't aware of until we did this project. It seems pretty cool. And so we'll talk about travel times in a second, but we started with all of that data, and we basically framed this as an optimization problem or an assignment problem. So how could we reassign census blocks to schools in ways that would actually minimize segregation while respecting a bunch of different constraints? So in particular, our objective function was to try to minimize white, non-white dissimilarity. We used the dissimilarity index as our primary measure of segregation. There's a lot of measures of segregation. We can sort of talk more about that if you're interested. But basically, the dissimilarity index goes from 0 to 1. A score of 1 means that a district is perfectly segregated, meaning all of the students from a particular racial or ethnic category are all concentrated in one school. And a score of 0 means that the district is perfectly integrated. And so every school the demographics of those schools looks like the demographics of the district overall. And so the best we can do is sort of what's going on in the district. A lot of segregation is due to sort of how the lines between districts are drawn. So we didn't focus on that. We focused kind of on the within district problem for now. But that's sort of the notion and definition of segregation we used. And then we had to kind of define a lot of different constraints, right? You could do this assignment problem, but there's no guarantee that families would actually respect the new assignments. And so some of the constraints that we imposed were One, kind of a max travel time increase. So how much further or how much longer should any child have to travel under a possible rezoning? And we actually ran, this is, very preliminary, but we just ran an online survey on the platform Prolific, which is sort of like a public opinion survey platform, just to start to get a sense of what are some increases in travel times that families might be willing to tolerate. And we saw that on average, families were driving about 10 minutes to school, and they'd be okay with driving 15 minutes to school if it meant their children having slightly more diverse classrooms. And similarly, you could imagine an integration strategy could be make one giant school in the whole district and have everyone go there, right? But of course, that's sort of impractical. But nevertheless, if you have some wiggle room in the sizes of schools, you might actually be able to achieve greater integration. And so that was another parameter we played with, was how much larger could sort of schools get in order to achieve more integration. And then, of course, contiguity. Now, unlike the previous talk, contiguity is not a legal requirement for attendance boundaries across most states, unlike sort of political districts. But we started by doing non-contiguous boundaries, and nobody likes those, unfortunately. So we showed a bunch of people a bunch of maps, and they just had this sort of visceral reaction to non-contiguous boundaries. So we imposed contiguity constraints. And we fed all of this to an optimization algorithm. We took this off the shelf through Google's OR tools library. So we use constraint programming. You could formulate this as an integer program. There's a lot of different ways to kind of solve this problem, but this seemed like a pretty powerful tool. And so we fed all of that to that model, and then sort of out comes a hypothetical rezoning, and then a couple of statistics about that rezoning. So one, of course, is kind of the possible benefit, right? So what's the actual change in segregation or change in dissimilarity that we can achieve in this rezoning? And then what are the costs, right? So how many students would have to switch schools as a result of this rezoning? And also, how much longer would people need to travel, right? So just trying to get a sense of what are the potential benefits and costs of doing this. And we simulated this across 98 large school districts. These are primary school districts whose elementary schools have primarily open enrollment kind of policies, meaning we didn't look at school choice. We can talk about sort of how we can potentially start to factor in school choice. I think Irene's and team's work yesterday gives some sense of that. But we simulated this for 98 school districts that serve just about 3 million elementary school students. And so just to quickly look at some results, so we saw that the median dissimilarity index across these 98 districts before rezoning was 0.39. So these are moderately segregated districts. And again, this is all white, non-white segregation. After we run our models, we see that the median is 0.33. So we certainly haven't solved the problem here, but we do see progress towards sort of more integration. And that works out when you sort of look at the pairwise decrease across districts, that works out to about a 12% relative decrease in segregation. Now, what did this cost, or what would this cost? So one, when you sort of average over all these districts, what's the percentage of students that would need to be rezoned? We see it's about 20% of students that would need to be rezoned in order to achieve these goals. What's interesting, again, this is an average, right? So it's masking a lot of sort of district level heterogeneities, but what's interesting is that the average this is pretty fairly balanced across different racial and ethnic groups. So again, on average, there doesn't seem to be one particular group of students that would really need to bear the brunt of desegregation. Again, the critical point here is to really look within districts to understand how this would differ at the district level. Possibly most surprising for us, though, was that we saw that this could actually slightly reduce travel times for families. And so this was really interesting for us, because there's really this kind of narrative around desegregation means busing, right? Or desegregation means, you just got to travel across the other side of the district. And that's certainly probably the case for extremely transformative change. But what our results seem to suggest is that there might be potential quick wins. Again, they're not going to solve the whole problem, but there could be potential quick wins that are within reach that could also not place this travel burden on families. And so that was sort of encouraging for us. Just to kind of zoom back into Atlanta. So we saw these two maps earlier. It's very hard to kind of see, but a lot of the change when you look at a rezoning is sort of happening, as you might imagine, given the map of Atlanta, sort of at the interface of the north and the south here. And when you kind of zoom into schools, there's some interesting stuff going on too. So each pair of schools, each pair of bars here represents an elementary school. The purple tells us the percentage of students who are white at that school before rezoning, and the turquoise tells us the purple who are white after rezoning. And the dashed line here tells us the district-wide proportion who are white. And so this is sort of like a goal line in some sense. If every bar were at that dashed line, the dissimilarity index would be 0. And you can see for most schools, there's not a lot of change, right? There's a bunch of kind of really high non-white percentage schools here where there's not much going on. But there is sort of this cluster of schools here. There's about 5 schools where you see pretty significant relative changes that could occur under this rezoning and really sort of achieving greater integration. But you also see some schools that seem to become more segregated, right? So the algorithm is sort of making this trade-off. It's saying, okay, we can kind of achieve this global objective, but there are certain schools that end up maybe paying more of a penalty for that. So of course, there's lots of kind of ways, both from the objective function standpoint and constraint standpoint that we might try to address some of that, but it's potentially kind of an interesting and relevant sort of policy implication as it's almost like a whack-a-mole problem, right? So are there sort of ways to maybe achieve a more globally satisfying result? But nevertheless, we were excited just to see that you might be able to integrate and not, significantly alter travel times. And so we built a dashboard. We ran these models for about 4,000 districts, and we built a dashboard. And if you're interested, you can sort of visit it and play around. And then we wanted to start to get feedback. We wanted to hear from districts and families just to get a sense of like, are these policy recommendations complete garbage? Like, is there anything interesting there, right? Is there something useful here that could be actually put to use? And so we tried to do that in a couple ways. One is we work with a nonprofit to get the email addresses, publicly available email addresses of thousands of elected school board members across the US. And we basically ran email campaigns. We targeted about 4,000 elected officials and 1,000 of the largest districts. And these were just cold emails. So we just sent cold emails. We played around actually with some kind of subject lines and marketing type of stuff and some interesting results on some outreach kind of framing and strategies that might be useful. But the point is, we were really surprised by the open rates. So the open rates were about 40%. The call to action was to visit the dashboard. The open rates were reasonably high, but the click rate was abysmally low. It was about 2.5%. Now, you could even say this is a random person emailing you. 2.5% of people clicking is still somewhat surprising. Nevertheless, it wasn't really kind of an effective strategy to get school boards to sort of visit the dashboard and check it out. So we also tried the press. And so there are a couple of press pieces on just talking about the finding and trying to drive people to the dashboard. And we saw that within about a 5-week period, we had about 3,700 people kind of explore different districts across the dashboard. And that was across 500 unique districts in 42 states. And what was interesting about that was that the districts that were more segregated were more likely to be explored. So that's sort of the objective, right? Like we want those districts that maybe where there is greater scope for change to be the ones that people are actually kind of investigating and looking into. And we heard some interesting feedback, kind of across the spectrum. So one board member actually visited this. We had a little survey people could fill out. One board member said, look, the computer program only had 1 school out of 13 with a significant change, which is not worth the headaches rezoning causes. The other 12 barely changed, if at all. So again, this is all a function of the constraints we set, right? We could rerun this with looser constraints, with looser kind of travel and other constraints, but at least for their particular district, the recommendation or kind of the possibility wasn't that exciting, right? Of course, other districts that saw more potential. So one said this is a helpful project, a worthy project. I think there are practical solutions to improving racial diversity here. Another one said, I'm a school board member who would like to chat with you about updating your maps to include more accurate information. Are you able to talk with me sometimes? So we've been having some of these conversations, which has been exciting. And first of all, just surprising, I think. We thought nobody would want to touch this problem with a 10-foot pole, but they seem to be wrestling with this. And I think there are a lot of school boards that are just looking for creative new ways to address this really entrenched issue. And so we're having some of these conversations right now, and we'll kind of keep you posted. But just to kind of summarize, we saw that redrawing attendance boundaries could reduce relative white, non-white segregation by about 12% and slightly reduce travel times by less than a minute, but it would require about 20% of students to switch schools. Districts, as I mentioned, seem interested in exploring how this could be put to use in their own context, but with fresher data, right? So they might have built a school since we kind of ran our models or other things, or also this whole issue of kind of selecting out of the district, right? I think this is a big limitation of this work. We're not modeling, we can't model sort of flight out of the district, but maybe partnering with districts will give us a better opportunity to do some of that. So in general, it seems like there might be potential for greater integration without significant disruptions for families, but the big question is there the political will to actually do something here, right? So some next steps, we're starting to work with some districts, in particular Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools, to start to kind of design new participatory ways of seeing if we can put these algorithms into use. So with some of the things we're just exploring is, hey, the algorithms are really good at producing a lot of possible boundary configurations? Can we sort of produce them? Start a conversation between kind of algorithm and families, right? Produce maps, get feedback from families on those maps or on potential new policies, and then factor kind of their preferences, what they have to say, back into the models in some way to, take those into account as constraints, right? Like we've kind of hard-coded constraints here. Maybe we can take map annotations as constraints. Maybe we can take other sorts of data as constraints and just have more realistic models. We're also working on a bunch of other kind of model specifications, constraints, objective functions, and starting to kind of look at, what would it mean to redraw between district boundaries? This is much more politically challenging because that's a state level decision versus this is sort of, attendance boundaries are at the purview of districts. But that is something we're starting to explore. Just want to give a shout out to our high school intern, Kumar, who's actually right here. Kumar, if you want to raise your hand. You all should talk to Kumar. He's doing a lot of this work. He actually was doing this for a science fair on his own, and we got put in touch. So Kumar has some really cool ideas about how to do this better, and he's sort of working on this as well. So thanks so much. Would love to hear from anybody who's interested in the dashboard, and we plan to release all the data and code for this after publication in case you want to play around. Thanks.
Oh yeah, so thanks so much for this paper, really interesting. So I know like you noted in the talk in the paper, the constraint of you're not able to look at parents who conditional on, white parents conditional on a school becoming more integrated with non-white students, either select out of the district or select into private schools within the district. But I do wonder just from a simulation perspective, if you could look at like conditional on this increase in non-white attendance, and especially depending on like the group that's increasing, because there's a lot of, sociological research on like different sort of outgroup bias, like, racial hierarchies between groups. Basically like how much the integration effect would be diluted given different percentages of white families, opting out of the newly integrated attendance. So
yeah, that's a great point. And so we haven't tried to do that, but we could start simply by just looking at enrollment data over time, right? And you can detect some of those shifts and sort of the racial composition and see if there's any predictive value there. I think it'd be even more relevant, of course, if we could look at boundary change data over time. So what are the enrollment changes that, presumably resulted from boundary changes, which itself is kind of a very hard kind of causal inference problem, but nevertheless, something you could sort of look into. The problem with that approach is that boundaries data, the last time the Department of Education did a boundaries survey was 2015, 2016. So there's commercial providers that are owning this data that you have to go to kind of get that district level boundaries data. So, but I think it's a great point. And we could at least start with kind of the tabular data from the Department of Education to start with. Thank you.
Thanks. I just want to follow up on that and say that in the context of Denmark, we actually have the estimates that you're looking for in terms of district changes and the causal effects on compliance. And we can see that there is a lot of systematic non-compliance for private school enrollment and people moving away. So, and also I think in the US that there are some older studies looking at court desegregation orders that you may want to look into, how people moved away from areas that were exposed to desegregation policies.
Thanks for that. Yeah, and I think I've seen the Denmark paper. I think what's really interesting about this too, and just in general, sort of contentious. First of all, school boards are like all of a sudden the most popular things in the world, right? And we see them in the New York Times all the time. But I think what's interesting is that one thing that I don't see a lot of discussion around is sort of the community engagement around these changes, right? So you set a change, and then, of course, if you're not engaging the community, which school boards, I mean, there's a few that probably do them well, but even the really big ones who have had a lot of time to figure it out are still trying to figure out, how do we get the trust of the community in this process, right? How do we kind of create a transparent process to make any kind of contentious policy change? So I think that process needs a lot of TLC and attention as well. And I think there is sort of a correlation where, or at least a hypothesis for us, which is why we want to try this. If you do that process really well, does it start to actually open people up to these things that maybe historically they would have fleed from, right? I mean, it's an open question, but I think it's something that is an important part of the research here.
Okay, we're going to wrap up for now. So let's thank all the speakers and all of you for the great questions.